Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson comes from Unit 6, about interest groups and political parties, and it's Lesson 8, about electoral activities. In this lesson, you'll learn about endorsing candidates, mobilizing voters, about political action committees, independent expenditures, and super PACs. In previous lessons, we've learned about how interest groups use different methods to get what they want from government. In the last couple of lessons, we learned about inside lobbying and outside lobbying. In this lesson, you'll learn about electoral activities. Electoral activities are the way that interest groups help certain candidates get elected, and they choose to help those candidates who they believe share their goals, and therefore will carry out their policy preferences once they're in office. To accomplish this, interest groups do several types of things in the category of electoral activities. We're going to talk about 4 of these things that they do. The first of those is endorsing candidates. When an interest group endorses a candidate, it's looking for a candidate that they believe is already sympathetic to their cause, whatever it is. And then what they do is they hope that voters who are sympathetic to their cause will cast votes for that candidate because they like them. So for example, in the background picture here, the interest group is a policemen's union. And what they've done is they have endorsed the candidate Donald Trump for president, believing that he will be more favorable to their interests as policemen. They hope by publicly making this endorsement that then voters out there who look at policemen and like them will then choose to also vote for Donald Trump. This is how endorsing a candidate can help an interest group get that person elected, and then they hope that person will carry out policies that they prefer. A second type of electoral activity engaged in by interest groups is mobilizing voters. By mobilizing voters, we mean that the interest group goes out and actually registers them to vote, encourages them to turn up at the polls, and may even transport them to the polls to vote. They're trying to get voters out to vote, and they try to walk them through by the hand every step of the way through the process. Now, you may wonder, as we discuss this idea of mobilizing voters, how the interest group can be sure that the voters are going to vote the right way once they get them there. I mean, after all, we have secret ballots in America. The interest group can't follow them into the poll and look over their shoulder and make sure they voted for the right person. The answer to this question is that interest groups rely upon self-identification from the voters. In other words, if they have some sort of indication that this person already supports their cause, maybe they're a member of their interest group, or maybe they've left posts on social media saying they support the ideas of their interest group or something like that, then they can be fairly confident that mobilizing that person, getting that person out to vote, will help their cause. But beyond that, they also rely upon demographics. In other words, if they simply know, for example, a person's education level, a person's income, a person's gender, a person's race, a person's religion, a person's employment, etc., they can make a pretty good guess of whether that person agrees with them or not on the issue that they're concerned about. And so they look for people that fit the proper demographics, and that's who they try to get into the voting booth, hoping that the odds will work out into their favor and that person will vote as they would like. A third kind of electoral activity that interest groups engage in is donating to campaigns. We're talking about them actually giving money to candidates who they believe will support the policies that they as an interest group favor. Now, interest groups, though, can't, by law, just hand the money to candidates. Instead, there are limits on how much money they can give. And the way that those donations are tracked to make sure that they don't violate those limits is that the interest groups have to go through kind of a complicated process to actually hand the money over to candidates. The way they do this is the interest group first must form what is called a PAC, or in other words, a political Action Committee. This is a designation created by the government. The government then keeps track of all the money going in and out of PACs. There are requirements that PACs have to follow for reporting these things. And then you can actually look up their donations online. So an interest group that wants to donate money has to create one of these legal entities called a PAC. They give their money to the PAC, and then the PAC is who turns around and gives it to candidates. This is all done just so the money can be kept track of, to make sure that the interest groups don't overstep their bounds and give more money than they should. Now, when they give money to these candidates, there's sort of this idea out there, this myth, that interest groups essentially buy the loyalty of politicians by handing them millions of dollars, and in return the politicians will go do whatever the interest group wants. Well, it's not that easy. Because the money is tracked through the use of PACs, and because there are limits to how much the PACs can give, about $5,000 to each candidate per each election cycle is what it's going to be. Because there's limits to how much they can give, they really can't buy candidates. Elections cost too much for PACs to be giving them enough money, for interest groups to be giving them enough money, that the politician just seems bought. Now, there is a way for them to give a little bit more than you'd think by a process called bundling. Not that you're going to be get that on an exam. But the basic idea is a PAC can encourage lots of other donors to get together and all make their own donations. And in that way, they think the politician will kind of give them credit for having organized it. But anyway, setting that aside, PACs really aren't going to be able to give enough money to buy politicians. So what are they giving their money for then? Well, what they're hoping is that they can give enough that the politician will remember and will then grant them access in the future. In other words, while an interest group can't give enough money where the politician will automatically agree with them, they may give enough money that the politician will feel obligated to give their lobbyist 10 minutes of his time to talk about their issue, whatever it is. And that in and of itself may be a victory for them, just getting in the door and starting the conversation. The last kind of electoral activity that interest groups engage in, we're going to talk about in this lesson, is what are called independent expenditures. Independent expenditures are funds that are spent to support a candidate, but they are not given to the candidate. As a matter of fact, they can't even be coordinated with the candidate. If the candidate participates in any way deciding how this money will be spent, it then, legally speaking, gets counted as a donation to the candidate. So this is money that the interest groups spend entirely on their own, without the candidate saying anything about how they spend it. Now, this is both good and bad from the view of the candidate. It's good because there's a lot more money than being spent on behalf of the candidate. They should appreciate that. It's kind of bad because they can't control the money. They can't decide where it should go. They can't advise on what the content of commercials are. Say, if the interest group decides to create its own commercial on behalf of the candidate and buy time on TV and air it themselves, the candidate may not end up liking that commercial in the end, but they really can't say anything one way or the other. Independent expenditures are unlimited, and this has given rise to the creation of what we call super PACs. These PACs can bring in massive amounts of money, tens of millions of dollars. Now, that's way more than they could give to candidates, but they don't care anymore because they can just spend it on their own to do their own activities to try to support the candidates. Because as long as they don't become directly involved with the candidate, they can collect and spend as much money as they want. That completes this lesson. Now let's review what we learned. Why do interest groups endorse candidates? Is it because other forms of support are not allowed? Is it so they can eventually join the campaign? Is it because it allows them to then donate to the candidate? Or is it to send a signal to voters? Interest groups endorse candidates to send a signal to voters. Essentially, they're saying, if you like us and we like this candidate, you should like him too. How do interest groups mobilize voters? Do they register them to vote? Do they encourage them to turn out and vote? Do they even transport them to the polls to vote? Or do they do all of the above? They do all of the above. Why form political action committees? Is it because interest groups have to do this to donate to candidates? Or do they do it to mobilize voters? Or do they do it to endorse candidates? Or do they do it to run their own candidates? Interest groups form political action committees to allow them to donate to candidates. Remember, this is required by election laws. What are independent expenditures? Are they money that's not spent on politics? Is it money that's coordinated with the campaign? Or is it money that's spent that can't be coordinated with the campaign? Or is it money that's limited by federal law? It's political expenditures by interest groups that is not coordinated with the campaign. Therefore, it's called independent, and it's actually unlimited. What do super PACs do? Do they make candidate donations? Do they make independent expenditures? Do they fund political parties? Or do they monitor PAC spending? Super PACs make independent expenditures, and they're called super PACs because the amount of money they can spend is unlimited. So they can collect tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars, and turn around and spend it on behalf of the candidates of their choice. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 6. It'll be Lesson 9. It'll be about litigation.